Ladies and gentlemen, there is nothing that unsettles a narcissistic personality more than an empath who has finally reached their limit. Not anger, not revenge, not confrontation, but clarity. Because when clarity enters the mind of an empath, manipulation loses its oxygen. Empathy is one of the most misunderstood strengths in human character. In a world that often celebrates dominance, loudness, and control, the empath's quiet sensitivity is frequently mistaken for fragility. But empathy is not weakness. It is heightened awareness. It is the ability to discern emotional shifts, to sense unspoken tensions, to understand motives beneath words. The empath does not simply hear what is said, they perceive what is meant. That is not weakness. That is intelligence operating at an emotional level. The confusion begins because empathy expresses itself through kindness, patience, and forgiveness. When someone consistently chooses understanding over confrontation, the untrained eye assumes they lack strength. When someone gives second chances, people assume they lack boundaries. When someone remains calm in conflict, others may assume they are afraid. But patience is not fear. Compassion is not submission. And understanding is not surrender. In unhealthy dynamics, especially with manipulative personalities, empathy can be exploited. A narcissistic individual studies reactions. They observe emotional patterns. They test limits. And when they encounter someone who continues to forgive, continues to explain, continues to hope for change, they interpret that endurance as weakness. They mistake access for control. They assume that because the empath stays, the empath cannot leave. But they misunderstand the source of the empath's behavior. An empath does not stay because they are powerless. They stay because they believe in potential. They stay because they value connection. They stay because they see not only what a person is, but what that person could become. This is vision, not vulnerability. However, when vision is not balanced with discernment, it becomes self-neglect. Empathy without boundaries creates exhaustion. When a person constantly absorbs others' emotions without protecting their own, they become depleted. Over time, the empath may begin to question themselves. They may ask, am I too sensitive? Am I expecting too much? Should I just try harder? This internal dialogue slowly erodes confidence. And this erosion is what manipulators rely on. But here is the truth: empathy is strongest when it is self-aware. A self-aware empath understands that compassion does not require self-sacrifice. They recognize that feeling deeply does not obligate them to tolerate disrespect. They know that understanding someone's trauma does not excuse toxic behavior. This awareness transforms empathy from a passive trait into an active strength. Strength is not measured by how much pain you can endure. Strength is measured by how clearly you understand your value. When an empath realizes that their kindness is a choice rather than an obligation, their entire posture changes. They no longer give to be accepted. They give from overflow. They no longer stay to prove loyalty. They stay where there is reciprocity. This shift is powerful because it disrupts unhealthy expectations. The manipulator who once relied on guilt finds it ineffective. The person who once used emotional chaos to maintain control encounters calm detachment instead. And the empath, once seen as easy to influence, becomes grounded and decisive. It is important to understand that empathy includes emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence involves recognizing patterns. It involves identifying inconsistencies between words and actions. It involves noticing when apologies lack behavioral change. An empath who activates their emotional intelligence becomes almost impossible to deceive. They feel the manipulation before it fully forms. This is why empathy should never be suppressed. It should be refined. Refined empathy asks questions. It evaluates actions. It pauses before reacting. It refuses to internalize blame that does not belong to it. It recognizes projection. It understands that not every emotional burden needs to be carried. Most importantly, refined empathy prioritizes inner peace. When empathy is combined with boundaries, it becomes formidable. Boundaries do not eliminate kindness, they protect it. They ensure that compassion is not wasted on cycles that produce no growth. They ensure that forgiveness is not extended endlessly without accountability. They ensure that love is not poured into containers that intentionally leak. There is also a deeper dimension to empathy: self-empathy. Many empaths extend extraordinary grace to others but deny it to themselves. They forgive everyone except their own mistakes. They comfort everyone except their own wounds. True strength emerges when the empath turns that compassion inward, when they begin to say, my feelings matter too. My exhaustion matters. My peace matters. The moment an empath embraces self-empathy, they stop negotiating their worth. They stop explaining boundaries repeatedly. They stop overextending to maintain harmony. They realize that harmony built on self-abandonment is not harmony at all, it is imbalance. And when this realization settles deeply, something extraordinary happens. The empath does not become harsh, they become steady. They do not become cold, they become clear. Their kindness remains, but it is no longer accessible to those who misuse it. Their love remains, but it is no longer offered without respect. Empathy at its highest level is leadership. It is the ability to understand human behavior without being controlled by it. It is the ability to care without collapsing. It is the ability to walk away without hatred. That is not weakness. That is disciplined strength. The world may misunderstand the empath for a season. Manipulative individuals may attempt to test their limits. But once empathy matures into wisdom, it becomes unshakable. It no longer bends under pressure. It no longer confuses endurance with purpose. It stands firm in truth while remaining soft in heart. And that balance, strength with compassion, clarity with care, is one of the most powerful forces a person can possess. Empathy is often misunderstood in a world that celebrates dominance and noise. Many assume that the person who listens more than they speak, who forgives more than they confront, and who understands more than they accuse is somehow weak. But empathy is not weakness. It is advanced emotional intelligence. It is the capacity to read environments, to discern unspoken pain, to recognize patterns in behavior long before others do. The empath sees beneath the surface. They notice inconsistencies. They sense tension shifts. They understand motives that are never verbally expressed. That is not fragility. That is perception. The danger arises when empathy operates without structure. When compassion is not governed by wisdom, it becomes self-neglect. An empath may stay too long in unhealthy dynamics because they see the wounded child behind the destructive adult. They excuse behavior because they understand the trauma that produced it. They rationalize disrespect because they believe love can heal it. But understanding someone's pain does not require accepting their abuse. Recognizing someone's wounds does not mean volunteering to become their bandage. When empathy lacks boundaries, it turns inward and begins to erode self-worth. The empath starts asking, "What did I do wrong?" instead of asking, "Why is this behavior acceptable?" They begin adjusting themselves to maintain harmony, shrinking their voice to prevent conflict, dimming their light to avoid intimidation. Over time, they lose connection with their own needs because they are hyper, focused on managing someone else's emotions. That is not empathy functioning properly. That is empathy being exploited. True empathy includes self-awareness. It recognizes that your emotional energy is valuable. It understands that compassion must be mutual to be sustainable. When an empath learns to say no without guilt, to walk away without dramatic explanation, to refuse responsibility for emotions they did not create, something powerful shifts. They are no longer operating from fear of abandonment. They are operating from clarity of identity. The moment an empath stops proving their worth and starts protecting their peace, manipulation loses effectiveness. The empath realizes that love is not endurance. Love is respect. Love is consistency. Love is safety. And once that standard is established internally, no external pressure can redefine it. This is when empathy transforms from vulnerability into strength. It becomes selective. It becomes disciplined. It becomes guided by principles instead of impulses. And that is when the empath is no longer easy to control. There is also a profound psychological shift that occurs when emotional detachment enters the picture. Emotional detachment is not bitterness. It is not revenge. It is not emotional shutdown. It is clarity without chaos. It is the ability to observe behavior without absorbing it. For someone who has relied on provoking reactions to feel powerful, this shift is deeply unsettling. A narcissistic personality structure thrives on engagement. Whether the engagement is positive or negative does not matter. Praise feeds it. Anger feeds it. Arguments feed it. Tears feed it. What matters is access. What matters is knowing they can still reach you emotionally. When an empath is emotionally entangled, their reactions become predictable. They defend themselves. They explain repeatedly. They attempt to fix misunderstandings. And in doing so, they remain engaged in the cycle. But when detachment begins, predictability disappears. The empath stops arguing. They stop over-explaining. They stop reacting to provocations designed to trigger insecurity. Instead of responding instantly, they pause. Instead of defending their character, they allow false narratives to collapse under their own weight. Instead of chasing resolution, they accept reality. This emotional steadiness creates discomfort for someone who depended on emotional turbulence. Loss of control is not dramatic at first. It is subtle. It is noticed in the silence after a baiting comment receives no response. It is felt in the calm tone that replaces emotional pleading. It is recognized when boundaries are enforced without anger. That calmness communicates something powerful. You no longer have access to my inner world. Control depends on emotional influence. When influence fades, insecurity rises. The manipulator may escalate tactics. They may provoke more intensely. They may attempt charm, guilt, or intimidation. But when the empath remains grounded, the strategy fails. The failure exposes a truth the narcissistic personality works hard to avoid. They are not as powerful as they believed. Emotional detachment forces accountability without confrontation. It holds up a mirror without speaking. It communicates that manipulation is ineffective. And that is destabilizing to someone who equates control with identity. The empath who has had enough is not loud about their transformation. They do not need to announce it. Their consistency speaks. Their calm speaks. Their refusal to re-enter chaos speaks. And in that quiet firmness, the balance of power shifts. This is not about punishing anyone. It is about reclaiming self-governance. It is about recognizing that your emotional energy is not public property. It is about understanding that access to you is a privilege, not a right. When empathy is strengthened by boundaries and detachment is guided by wisdom, the empath becomes unshakable. They no longer operate from reaction. They operate from choice. And once a person begins choosing themselves with clarity, control over them becomes impossible. To understand why a narcissistic personality becomes unsettled when an empath reaches their limit, you must first understand the architecture of control. Control is not always loud. It is often subtle, emotional, and psychological. It operates through guilt, confusion, praise followed by withdrawal, affection followed by silence. The goal is not partnership, the goal is positioning. The narcissistic mindset positions itself at the center of the emotional environment. Everything must orbit around its needs, its image, its comfort. When you are constantly explaining yourself, defending yourself, or trying to restore peace after every storm, you are not in a relationship of equality. You are in a system of control. Control survives on access. It needs your attention, your emotional energy, your reactions. Even negative reactions can serve the system because they prove you are still engaged. As long as you are trying, hoping, arguing, or fixing, the structure remains intact. That is why the most powerful disruption is not confrontation, it is withdrawal of emotional participation. When an empath begins to observe instead of absorb, the cycle weakens. When they stop personalizing manipulation, the tactics lose effectiveness. Control depends on your belief that you are responsible for someone else's emotional stability. The moment you reject that responsibility, you remove the foundation on which manipulation stands. Empathy is often misunderstood in this dynamic. Many believe empathy is softness, fragility, or excessive sensitivity. In reality, empathy is advanced perception. It is the ability to detect emotional shifts, to read unspoken signals, to sense discomfort in a room before words are spoken. The danger arises when empathy is not balanced by boundaries. An empath can become so skilled at understanding others that they forget to advocate for themselves. They become translators of dysfunction, interpreters of poor behavior, defenders of those who refuse to grow. They see potential where there is only pattern. They see woundedness and attempt to heal it, even at the expense of their own well-being. But empathy without self-respect becomes self-neglect. Patience turns into tolerance of disrespect. Loyalty turns into attachment to instability. Compassion turns into justification for repeated harm. The empath does not suffer because they are weak. They suffer because they believe their love can transform someone who is not committed to transformation. And that belief keeps them invested long after the evidence suggests they should walk away. Then comes the shift. It is rarely dramatic. It is quiet, internal, decisive. The empath becomes tired, not just emotionally, but spiritually. They begin to notice patterns instead of promises. They stop focusing on words and start observing consistency. They realize that love should not require constant recovery. And in that awareness, strength emerges. When an empath has had enough, they do not necessarily become angry. They become clear. Clarity is dangerous to manipulation. Clarity asks different questions. It asks, why am I the only one adjusting? It asks, why does peace only exist when I stay silent? It asks, why am I shrinking to maintain connection? These questions awaken identity. The transformation from emotional survival to intentional living begins here. Instead of reacting, the empath starts choosing. Instead of explaining, they start conserving energy. Instead of seeking validation, they cultivate self-trust. Emotional detachment does not mean they stop caring. It means they stop chasing. They stop negotiating their worth. They stop participating in arguments designed to exhaust rather than resolve. This detachment shakes the narcissistic structure because it interrupts predictability. The manipulator expects tears, long messages, attempts at reconciliation. They expect access. But when the empath becomes steady, composed, and internally anchored, the tactics fall flat. Silence replaces pleading. Boundaries replace bargaining. Observation replaces reaction. Boundaries are not punishments, they are declarations. They say, "This is who I am, and this is what I will no longer tolerate." A boundary is not about controlling another person's behavior. It is about controlling your access. It communicates that your peace is valuable. And when an empath enforces boundaries consistently, they shift from being emotionally managed to being self-led. The most powerful moment in this journey is when the empath stops trying to prove their value. They understand that worth is not negotiated through endurance. They recognize that love is not measured by how much pain they can withstand. They realize that walking away from dysfunction is not failure. It is alignment. The narcissistic personality is shaken not because the empath becomes cruel, but because they become unavailable for exploitation. They no longer respond to emotional bait. They no longer rush to repair situations they did not break. They no longer allow guilt to override intuition. And in that transformation, the empath discovers something greater than control over another person. They discover control over themselves. They discover that peace is a choice. They discover that strength is quiet. They discover that the greatest victory is not changing someone else's behavior, but changing their own standards. When an empath has had enough, they do not collapse. They evolve. And evolution always disrupts systems that depended on your silence, your sacrifice, and your self-doubt. The true nature of narcissistic control is not loud dominance, it is subtle dependency. Control, in this dynamic, is built on emotional access. It survives on your reactions, your explanations, your attempts to fix what you did not break. A narcissistic personality studies your responses the way a strategist studies a battlefield. They learn what triggers guilt in you, what awakens your compassion, what pushes you to overextend yourself. Control is maintained not by strength, but by predictability. If they can predict your forgiveness, your empathy, your return after every disappointment, then they feel secure. What unsettles them is not conflict, it is unpredictability. When the empath begins to respond differently, when the emotional script changes, the illusion of control begins to collapse. The narcissist depends on emotional leverage, and leverage only works when the other person continues to lift the weight. Empathy, however, is often misunderstood. Many empaths are told they are too sensitive, too emotional, too forgiving. But empathy is not fragility, it is perception. It is the rare ability to sense what is not being said, to feel the undercurrents in a room, to understand pain without it being explained. The danger is not in empathy itself. The danger lies in empathy without boundaries. When empathy operates without self-respect, it becomes self-neglect. An empath may stay longer than they should because they understand the wounds behind the behavior. They may excuse repeated harm because they can see the insecurity behind the arrogance. They may silence their own needs because they are focused on stabilizing someone else's emotions. Over time, this creates imbalance. The empath becomes the emotional caretaker, while their own emotional world is left unattended. The narcissist mistakes this compassion for weakness, not realizing that empathy is strength under control. When that strength is redirected inward, when the empath decides to protect their own well-being with the same intensity they once used to protect others, the entire dynamic shifts. There comes a defining moment in the life of an empath who has endured too much. It is rarely dramatic, it is rarely announced, it is quiet. It is internal. It is the realization that love should not require self-erasure. That moment is powerful because it is rooted in clarity, not anger. Anger reacts. Clarity decides. When the empath reaches this point, emotional detachment begins, not out of spite, but out of survival and growth. Emotional detachment does not mean the absence of care. It means the presence of wisdom. It means recognizing that continued engagement in manipulation only reinforces it. The empath stops arguing to be understood, stops defending their character against constant distortion, stops chasing validation from someone committed to withholding it. This withdrawal of emotional energy is what disrupts the narcissistic system. The usual tactics no longer produce the same outcomes. The guilt trips meet calm responses. The provocations meet silence. The dramatics meet composure. And in that composure lies power. The psychology behind a narcissist's fear of losing control is deeply connected to identity. Control gives them a sense of significance. If they can influence your emotions, dictate your reactions, or shape your decisions, they feel powerful. But when an empath establishes firm boundaries, something profound happens. Boundaries communicate self-definition. They say without shouting, "I know who I am. and I will not compromise that to keep you comfortable. This is destabilizing to someone who relies on blurred lines and emotional confusion. A boundary is not aggression, it is clarity in action. It removes negotiation where self-respect is concerned. It limits access where access has been abused. For the narcissist, this feels like rejection of their authority. For the empath, it is the restoration of personal authority. Silence becomes another transformative tool. Silence is not withdrawal in defeat, it is restraint in strength. When the empath no longer feels compelled to respond to every accusation, to defend against every projection, or to participate in every cycle of drama, they reclaim their emotional sovereignty. Silence denies the manipulator an audience. It eliminates the reinforcement of unhealthy patterns. And most importantly, it gives the empath space to rebuild their internal stability. The narcissist may attempt escalation at this stage, greater charm, deeper guilt, louder blame, because the usual mechanisms are failing. But when the empath remains grounded, the imbalance becomes visible. Ultimately, the transformation from enduring to empowered is an educational journey. The empath learns that compassion must include the self. That understanding someone's pain does not require tolerating their abuse. That love without respect is not love at all. And when this understanding becomes conviction, the dynamic can no longer function as it once did. The narcissist is shaken not because the empath became cruel, but because the empath became conscious. Conscious people cannot be easily controlled. They respond intentionally rather than react emotionally. They choose peace over proving a point. They prioritize growth over attachment to dysfunction. Nothing shakes a narcissistic personality more than an empath who has had enough, because that empath is no longer operating from emotional exhaustion, but from awakened identity. An awakened identity cannot be manipulated. To understand why a narcissistic personality is shaken when an empath has had enough, you must first understand the structure of control. Control is built on predictability. A manipulative individual studies your reactions, memorizes your triggers, and learns how to pull emotional responses from you on demand. They rely on your empathy to keep the cycle alive. Your willingness to listen, to forgive, to explain, to give Horn more chance becomes the very system that sustains their influence. But control is fragile. It only works when the other person participates. The moment participation stops, the illusion collapses. When an empath becomes unpredictable, not through chaos, but through calm detachment, the narcissistic system destabilizes. The arguments no longer escalate. The guilt tactics no longer penetrate. The emotional drama no longer produces results. And without results, control loses its purpose. This is deeply unsettling for someone who depends on dominance for validation. Empathy is often misunderstood as weakness because it expresses itself through patience and understanding. However, empathy is actually heightened awareness. An empath senses emotional shifts, detects inconsistencies, and recognizes pain beneath behavior. The problem arises when awareness is not matched with boundaries. When empathy operates without self-protection, it becomes self-sacrifice. The empath begins to overextend, over-explain, and overcompensate. They try to heal what they did not break. They attempt to fix what they did not damage. Over time, this creates internal exhaustion. But exhaustion can become revelation. When an empath finally realizes that their compassion has been exploited rather than appreciated, something changes internally. They begin to value their emotional energy as a limited resource. They recognize that understanding someone does not require enduring their mistreatment. That realization marks the beginning of strength. True empathy includes self-respect. And once self-respect awakens, tolerance for manipulation diminishes rapidly. The most powerful shift occurs during emotional detachment. Detachment is not anger, it is not revenge, it is clarity in action. It is the conscious decision to stop investing emotionally where there is no mutual growth. This is the turning point that unsettles a narcissistic personality the most. They are accustomed to reactions. They expect tears, arguments, long messages, emotional pleas, and attempts to repair the connection. What they do not expect is calm distance. When the empath stops reacting, the usual strategies fail. Emotional hooks find no attachment point. Provocations lose their impact. Silence replaces explanation, and silence forces reflection. The manipulator can no longer rely on predictable emotional supply. Emotional detachment communicates something powerful without words. I am no longer available for this dynamic. That message threatens the very foundation of control because it removes access. Without access, influence fades. Without influence, superiority feels unstable. Detachment therefore becomes a mirror, reflecting back the manipulator's own insecurity. Boundaries are the practical expression of this internal transformation. A boundary is not a threat. It is not punishment. It is a line drawn from self-awareness. When an empath establishes a boundary, they are defining what behavior they will and will not accept. This is revolutionary in a dynamic built on tolerance. Boundaries shift responsibility. Instead of constantly adjusting to accommodate someone else's dysfunction, the empath now expects accountability. This creates tension because it challenges entitlement. A narcissistic personality often believes they are exempt from limits. They are accustomed to others bending, excusing, and adapting. But boundaries remove that privilege. They create consequences without hostility. They establish distance without drama. And most importantly, they reinforce identity. When an empath says no without guilt or withdraws without explanation, they communicate that their peace is non-negotiable. That level of self-definition disrupts manipulation because manipulation depends on blurred lines and emotional confusion. Clear boundaries eliminate confusion. The final and most profound transformation is the shift from seeking validation to embodying self-leadership. Many empaths remain in unhealthy dynamics because they hope to be understood. They believe that if they explain clearly enough, love deeply enough, or endure patiently enough, the other person will change. But growth does not come from convincing someone to value you. It comes from valuing yourself without negotiation. When an empath has had enough, they stop trying to be chosen and start choosing themselves. This is not arrogance. It is alignment. They redirect their compassion inward. They invest in healing, growth, and emotional independence. And this independence is what truly shakes a narcissistic personality. Because when you no longer seek their approval loses power. When you no longer fear their withdrawal, their threats lose influence. When you no longer measure your worth by their attention becomes irrelevant. Self-leadership means you govern your own emotions, decisions, and direction. And once you govern yourself, no one else can control you. Nothing shakes manipulation more than maturity. Nothing unsettles control more than calm confidence. When empathy is strengthened by boundaries and guided by self-respect, it becomes unstoppable. The empath who has had enough does not become cold, they become disciplined. They do not lose their heart, they protect it. And in protecting it, they discover something greater than validation from others. They discover authority within themselves. A narcissistic personality survives on control, but control is not always loud or obvious. It is often subtle, psychological, and emotional. It works through confusion, guilt, and dependency. The narcissist studies reactions. They observe what triggers you, what hurts you, what makes you chase approval. Their influence depends on your emotional participation. If you argue, they win. If you defend yourself constantly, they win. If you try endlessly to prove your loyalty, they win. Why? Because the system is built on access to your energy. The moment you understand that control is sustained by your reactions, you begin to see that your greatest weapon is not force, it is self-mastery. Control cannot survive where there is no emotional supply. And once you see the pattern, you are no longer unconsciously feeding it. Empathy, in its purest form, is strength. It is emotional intelligence in action. It is the ability to discern what others feel without losing yourself. However, when empathy lacks boundaries, it becomes vulnerability to manipulation. Many empaths are conditioned to believe that enduring mistreatment is a sign of loyalty, that overextending themselves is proof of love, and that self-sacrifice guarantees harmony. But education teaches us that love and tolerance are not the same. Endurance is not always virtue. When empathy is guided by wisdom, it knows when to give and when to withdraw. It understands that compassion does not require self-abandonment. The empath who learns this lesson begins to operate from strength instead of sentiment. They begin to recognize that protecting their peace is not selfish, it is responsible. There comes a moment in the life of an empath when exhaustion turns into awakening. It is not dramatic. It is not loud. It is a quiet internal decision that says, I will no longer participate in what diminishes me. This is the turning point that destabilizes the narcissistic dynamic. Emotional detachment is not hatred, it is clarity. It is the understanding that love cannot fix someone who refuses accountability. When an empath detaches, they stop explaining themselves repeatedly. They stop trying to earn basic respect. They stop negotiating their worth. This detachment removes the unpredictability that the narcissist relies on. It shifts the balance of power. Because when you no longer need validation from someone committed to misunderstanding you, you become unshakable. What truly unsettles a narcissistic personality is the loss of influence. Their fear is not of confrontation, it is of irrelevance. When an empath sets firm, consistent boundaries, the narcissist feels the ground shift beneath them. Boundaries are not emotional outbursts. They are calm decisions backed by action. They are the refusal to engage in circular arguments. They are the choice to walk away from disrespect without lengthy explanations. From an educational perspective, boundaries function as psychological filters. They determine what behavior you accept and what behavior you reject. When these filters are strong, manipulation cannot pass through. The narcissist senses that their old strategies no longer produce results, and this loss of control creates internal instability for them. Silence becomes one of the most powerful tools in this transformation. Silence is often misunderstood as weakness or avoidance. In reality, silence can be disciplined restraint. It is the refusal to fuel unnecessary conflict. When an empath stops reacting impulsively, the narcissist loses their stage. No reaction means no performance. No emotional explosion means no reward. This disciplined silence forces a shift. Instead of managing your emotions, the narcissist must face their own. And that is deeply uncomfortable for someone who avoids self-examination. Silence communicates confidence. It says, "I do not need to convince you of my value." And that quiet confidence speaks louder than any argument ever could. Ultimately, the journey of the empath who has had enough is not about defeating another person. It is about rediscovering self, leadership. Education in emotional maturity teaches that freedom begins internally. When you stop measuring your worth by someone else's approval, you break psychological dependency. When you choose peace over proving a point, you elevate beyond manipulation. The empath who reaches this stage does not become cold, they become balanced. They still possess compassion, but it is now directed wisely. They still love deeply, but they no longer love blindly. This transformation is what shakes the narcissistic dynamic at its core, because the very qualities that once made you controllable, your kindness, your patience, your hope, are now governed by strength and discernment. And once empathy is reinforced by boundaries, it becomes untouchable. To understand why a narcissistic personality becomes unsettled when an empath has had enough, you must first understand the nature of control. Control is not always loud or aggressive. Often it is subtle. It operates through guilt, confusion, emotional highs and lows, and the constant shifting of responsibility. The narcissistic mindset depends on maintaining emotional leverage. It survives on access to your reactions, your explanations, your attempts to fix what you did not break. When you are constantly trying to restore peace, you are unknowingly feeding the very chaos that destabilizes you. Control is sustained not by strength, but by your continued participation in the cycle. Empathy, on the other hand, is frequently misunderstood. Many people believe that because empaths are patient, forgiving, and emotionally available, they are weak. But empathy is actually a sophisticated emotional intelligence. It is the ability to perceive nuance, to sense unspoken pain, and to respond with understanding rather than impulse. The challenge arises when empathy is not balanced with self-respect. When you continuously extend grace without requiring growth, you begin to train others to disregard your boundaries. Empathy without discernment becomes self-sacrifice. However, when empathy is paired with wisdom, it transforms into strength that cannot be manipulated. There comes a defining moment in the life of an empath, the moment of internal clarity. This moment is rarely dramatic. It does not require confrontation or announcement. It is a quiet awakening. You begin to recognize patterns instead of promises. You stop focusing on words and start evaluating behavior. You realize that your emotional labor has not produced mutual respect. This awareness shifts your posture. You no longer argue to be understood. You no longer beg for emotional consistency. You no longer chase reassurance. Instead, you observe, and observation breaks illusion. When illusion breaks, manipulation loses its foundation. Emotional detachment is often misinterpreted as cruelty, but in truth it is discipline. Detachment does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop allowing your care to override your well-being. It is the ability to step back and assess without absorbing every emotional wave thrown at you. For a narcissistic personality, detachment is destabilizing because it removes the predictable pattern of reaction. If they provoke and you do not respond, the script fails. If they withdraw and you do not chase, the strategy collapses. Emotional detachment is powerful because it shifts the dynamic from reactive to intentional. You regain control of your own emotional climate. At the heart of the narcissistic mindset is a deep fear of losing control. Control provides a sense of identity and superiority. When an empath finally establishes firm boundaries, it interrupts that sense of dominance. Boundaries communicate self-awareness. They say, "I recognize my limits and I respect them." This is not hostility, it is clarity. Boundaries are not about changing another person's behavior. They are about defining what you will and will not accept. When consistently enforced, boundaries teach others how to engage with you. More importantly, they teach you how to value yourself. And when your value is no longer negotiable, manipulation becomes ineffective. Silence becomes one of the most transformative tools in this journey. Silence is not avoidance, it is restraint. It is the decision to stop over, explaining yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you. When you refuse to defend your truth repeatedly, you demonstrate confidence in it. Silence removes the audience from the performance. It deprives manipulation of the attention it requires. This kind of silence is not passive. It is active self-protection. It allows space for reflection instead of reaction. It creates room for your emotional system to stabilize rather than remain in constant turbulence. The final transformation is the most powerful, the shift from emotional survival to intentional living. When you have had enough, you stop organizing your life around managing someone else's moods. You redirect your energy toward growth, purpose, and peace. You begin to invest in your own development. You cultivate relationships that are reciprocal. You strengthen your self-trust. This transformation is unsettling to anyone who benefited from your previous tolerance. Not because you became harsh, but because you became whole. Wholeness is intimidating to those who relied on your fragmentation. An empath who has reached their limit does not lose their compassion. They refine it. They learn that love must include self-respect. They understand that forgiveness does not require continued access. They recognize that their emotional depth is a gift, but only when governed by boundaries. The greatest disruption to manipulation is not aggression, it is growth. When you grow beyond the need for validation from those who diminish you, you become steady, and steadiness cannot be shaken. Nothing unsettles a narcissistic personality more than an empath who has decided to protect their peace. Because once you choose clarity over chaos, discipline over drama, and self-respect over approval, the cycle ends. And when the cycle ends, your freedom begins. A narcissistic personality operates from a deep need for control, validation, and emotional supply. Control is not always loud or aggressive. Often it is subtle, psychological, and strategic. It shows up through guilt, gaslighting, silent treatment, blame shifting, and emotional unpredictability. The purpose of these behaviors is not connection, but dominance over perception. When someone can influence how you see yourself, they influence how you behave. That is the core of manipulation. Understanding this dynamic is crucial because it reveals that the struggle was never about love, it was about leverage. The narcissist studies reactions, learns triggers, and repeats patterns that keep the other person emotionally engaged. Once you recognize that control survives on your emotional participation, you begin to see why withdrawing that participation becomes so powerful. Empathy, on the other hand, is one of the most misunderstood strengths. An empath feels deeply, discerns emotional shifts quickly, and often senses unspoken pain. However, empathy without boundaries becomes vulnerability to exploitation. Many empaths are conditioned to believe that understanding someone means tolerating their behavior. They become problem solvers for people who do not want solutions, only supply. The empath's willingness to forgive, to see potential, and to hold space for growth is admirable. But when it is not reciprocated, it becomes draining. True empathy includes self-empathy. It requires recognizing when compassion for others is turning into neglect of oneself. Strength is not measured by how much you can endure. It is measured by how clearly you can decide what you will no longer endure. The turning point for an empath is rarely explosive. It is cumulative. It is built from repeated disappointments, broken promises, emotional exhaustion, and the slow erosion of self-worth. One day, the empath realizes they are tired of explaining, tired of defending, tired of hoping. This moment is not bitterness, it is awakening. The awakening says, I see the pattern now. And once a pattern is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen. This is the birth of emotional independence. The empath begins to detach not out of revenge, but out of recognition. Recognition that love cannot grow where respect does not exist. Recognition that potential is not reality. Recognition that peace is more valuable than proximity. Emotional detachment is often misunderstood as cruelty, but in truth, it is self-preservation guided by wisdom. Detachment does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop carrying what is not yours. It is the discipline of no longer reacting to provocation. It is choosing not to engage in circular arguments designed to confuse rather than resolve. When detachment occurs, the emotional intensity that once fueled the toxic cycle disappears. The narcissistic personality senses this shift immediately because the familiar responses are gone. The drama no longer escalates. The manipulation no longer hooks. The empath becomes calm where they were once reactive. That calm is not emptiness, it is strength under control. What unsettles a narcissistic personality most is the loss of predictable access. They rely on emotional responses to confirm influence. When the empath stops responding in expected ways, uncertainty is introduced. Uncertainty disrupts control. The narcissist may attempt to provoke stronger reactions, escalate tactics, or suddenly offer affection to regain influence. This phase often reveals the depth of their dependency on emotional supply. But the empowered empath, having reached clarity, sees these attempts for what they are: strategies to restore imbalance. Knowledge becomes protection. Awareness becomes armor. Boundaries then become the defining act of transformation. A boundary is not a demand that someone change. It is a decision about what you will accept. It is not about controlling others. It is about governing yourself. When an empath establishes clear boundaries, they communicate self-respect. They no longer negotiate their dignity for temporary peace. They understand that discomfort in setting limits is temporary, but discomfort in tolerating disrespect is ongoing. Boundaries shift relationships because they redefine access. They say, "You may be in my life, but not at the cost of my identity." That declaration alone changes the dynamic. Silence becomes one of the most powerful tools in this transformation. Silence is not passive aggression, it is selective engagement. It is the refusal to argue with distortion. It is the understanding that not every accusation requires a defense. When you stop over explaining yourself, you signal confidence. When you stop chasing understanding from someone committed to misunderstanding you, you conserve energy. Silence removes the stage upon which manipulation performs. Without an audience, performance loses purpose. This quiet strength often speaks louder than confrontation ever could. Ultimately, the empath who has had enough undergoes a profound internal shift. They move from seeking validation to embodying self-assurance. They stop measuring their worth by someone else's approval. They invest in healing, growth, and self-awareness. The focus changes from fixing another person to developing themselves. This transformation is what truly shakes a narcissistic personality, because the dynamic they relied upon no longer exists. The empath is no longer available for emotional extraction. They are no longer persuaded by guilt. They are no longer intimidated by withdrawal. This journey is not about defeating anyone. It is about rediscovering yourself. It is about understanding that empathy guided by wisdom is unstoppable. When compassion is balanced with boundaries, it becomes strength. When love is aligned with self-respect, it becomes healthy. And when an empath finally says, "Enough," it is not the end of their softness. It is the beginning of their sovereignty. When you reach the point where you say, "Enough," you are not ending something. You are beginning something. You are beginning self-leadership. You are beginning emotional independence. You are beginning a life where your peace is no longer negotiable. And that is not just powerful, that is unstoppable.